What would you do if the life you built, the wealth, the success, the perfect future, was suddenly turned upside down by a secret from your past? For Edward Langston, a self-made millionaire at the peak of his game, that moment came on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. As he stood at the altar, ready to marry the woman of his dreams, one unexpected arrival shattered everything he thought he knew about himself, and forced him to confront the family he never knew he had. This is a story about choices, consequences, and the true meaning of wealth. And trust me, you won't see the twist coming. Are you ready? Let's dive in. The Manhattan skyline glowed amber under the dusk as Edward Langston stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, a crystal tumbler of Macallan 25 in hand. At 36, he'd built his tech empire from a garage startup into a billion-dollar conglomerate. Now, in a tailored Brioni suit, he surveyed the city he owned, a kingdom of steel and ambition. Yet, the view couldn't quiet the restlessness gnawing at him. Veronica St. James, his fiancée, swept into the room, her ivory silk robe whispering against marble floors. A fifth-generation heiress to the St. James Railroad dynasty, she was everything Edward's humble roots weren't: pedigreed, polished, untouchable. Her engagement ring, a 10-carat emerald-cut diamond, caught the light as she handed him an ivory envelope embossed with gold. "The invitations are ready," she said, her voice a velvet purr. "Shall I have your assistant mail Clara's?" Edward's jaw tightened. Clara Matthews. 5 years since he'd last seen her, but her name still carved a hollow ache in his chest. She'd left him at a crossroads, him a self-made mogul on the rise, and her, a fiery art student who'd called his penthouse soulless and his ambitions a cage. He'd let her walk. Married Veronica. Built an empire. And now, he'd shove his victory in her face. "Send it," he said, swirling his scotch. "But make sure it's hand-delivered." Veronica arched a brow. "Still playing games, darling?" "Just ensuring she knows what she missed." But as Veronica left, Edward's gaze lingered on the envelope. Unbeknownst to him, Clara wouldn't be coming alone. 300 miles away, in a sunlit loft in Brooklyn, Clara Matthews balanced a toddler on her hip while sketching a mural of starfish and mermaids. At 32, her life was a kaleidoscope of chaos: paint-splattered jeans, bedtime stories, and gallery deadlines. Her twins, James and Amelia, raced toy cars across the floor, while Theo, her eldest at 6, practiced piano, a cacophony of off-key twinkle-twinkles. The doorbell rang. Clara wiped charcoal-smudged hands on her apron and answered it to find a courier holding a gilded envelope. Her breath hitched. Edward Langston and Veronica St. James shimmered in gold script. Inside, the invitation was a masterpiece of opulence: vellum petals layered like a rose, a date set in 6 weeks, and a note scribbled in Edward's jagged handwriting: "couldn't let old ghosts miss the happiest day of my life." Her throat burned. Old ghosts. She'd loved him once, recklessly, until he'd chosen boardrooms over beach trips, power over passion. Now, he wanted to parade his trophy wife in front of her. "Mommy, who's that?" Theo peeked around her legs, snagging the envelope. "Junk mail," Clara lied, but Theo had already spotted the names. "Edward Langston? You knew a millionaire?" Former millionaire, she muttered, snatching it back. "And he's not important." But that night, she lay awake, invitation clutched to her chest. The kids adored weddings. Amelia had cried at her cousins, because the dress was sparkly, and Clara couldn't bear to disappoint them. Yet, showing up felt like surrender. "Let him see you're thriving," she thought. "Let him see you don't need his world." By dawn, she'd decided. She'd attend. Not for Edward, but to prove to herself that she'd outgrown the girl who'd once cried over his empty promises. Unbeknownst to Edward, Clara wasn't just bringing her art or her pride. She was bringing 3 children, his children. And Manhattan would never be the same. The memory hit Edward like a punch, a cramped trailer in nowhere, Indiana, where the smell of motor oil and his father's frustration clung to the air. Young Eddie Langston, age 10, crouched at the kitchen table, scribbling math problems by the dim glow of a flickering bulb. His father, a mechanic with grease under his nails and a perpetual scowl, slammed the fridge shut. "You think numbers'll feed us, boy?" But Eddie knew. Numbers were his lifeline. While his classmates played baseball, he'd pore over library books, devouring stories of Carnegie and Rockefeller. His mother, a waitress with varicose veins and a smile that never wavered, slipped him quarters for the bus to the county library. "You're gonna fly so high, Eddie," she'd whisper. "Just don't forget where you came from." At 14, he worked nights at a gas station, saving every penny. At 17, he earned a full scholarship to MIT, a golden ticket out of the Rust Belt. The day he left, his father grunted, "Don't come back a failure." His mother hugged him, tears soaking his threadbare shirt. Eddie vowed never to return. Never be poor again. By 25, he'd founded Langston Tech, coding algorithms in a garage while subsisting on ramen. Investors laughed at his naive vision of AI-driven logistics. But Eddie didn't need their approval. He sold his first app to Amazon for $20 million. Power, he realized, wasn't about money. It was about never being invisible again. The Harvard-Yale mixer was a sea of bow ties and entitlement. Edward, now a 28-year-old CEO in a rented tux, loathed these events. But his CFO had insisted, "Network, Edward. You're still a nobody to these people." Then he saw her. Clara Matthews, wild curls, paint-stained fingers, and a laugh that turned heads, was perched on a marble countertop, arguing with a philosophy major about Kafka. Her thrift store dress was 2 sizes too big, and she wore cowboy boots. Ridiculous. Intriguing. "Ever read The Metamorphosis?" she asked, hopping down. "Or are you too busy monetizing your soul?" Edward smirked. "I prefer The Art of War." "Ugh. Predictable." She stuck out a hand, smearing acrylic paint on his sleeve. "Clara. I'm an artist." "And you're leaving," he said, but stayed. They talked for hours, about her mural project in the Bronx, his obsession with efficiency. She called him a robot with a pulse. He called her a tornado in a world of straight lines. When she kissed him behind the art studio at 2 a.m., her hands smelled of turpentine and rebellion. For a year, they burned brightly. Clara dragged him to jazz clubs and protest marches. He bought her a loft to paint in. But cracks formed. Edward missed gallery openings for board meetings. Clara accused him of collecting life like stock portfolios. The night he proposed, a diamond as cold as his penthouse, she'd whispered, "I can't breathe here," and walked away. Now, as Edward stared at Clara's RSVP card, regrets, Clara Matthews and family, he felt the old anger flare. She'd chosen chaos over him. And soon, she'd see exactly what she'd thrown away. By 30, Edward's startup had exploded into a tech juggernaut. Clara remembered when his office was their cluttered loft. Now it was a skyscraper with a glass-walled suite. She'd supported him, even selling a prized painting to fund his first server upgrade. But success had a way of warping things. "Cancel dinner," Edward barked into his phone one evening, pacing the loft. "The Hong Kong deal's collapsing." Clara lowered her brush, her half-finished mural of Central Park wilting under the studio lights. "It's our anniversary, Edward." He froze. "Shit. Clara, I don't." She forced a smile. "Go save the world." But the absences piled up. Edward missed gallery openings, birthdays, even the miscarriage she'd suffered alone. He sent flowers, sure, dozen red roses, a note, forgive me. But it wasn't the same as holding her. One night, after a 14-hour grind, he stumbled home to find Clara curled on the couch, her sketchbook open to a drawing of them, Edward as a shadowy figure, Clara fading into the background. "You're not even here anymore," she said quietly. "I'm building something," he snapped, loosening his tie. "You think art pays the bills?" Clara's eyes flashed. "You used to say art was the only thing that mattered." Edward sighed, rubbing his temples. "People change." The end came on a rain-soaked October night. Edward had cancelled their weekend getaway again for a critical board meeting. Clara waited until he returned, her suitcase packed by the door. "You missed Theo's birth," she said, voice steady. "And the twins. And every damn moment since." Edward's face hardened. "You think I wanted to miss it? This company is your child, right?" Clara laughed bitterly. "Well, guess what? Our kids need a father, not a paycheck." Edward's fist slammed the counter. "You think I don't know that? I'm doing this for you, for all of us." "No," Clara shot back, tears streaking her cheeks. "You're doing it because you're terrified of being that trailer park kid again. But you're already a ghost, Edward. And I can't keep chasing shadows." Edward's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm done." She handed him a ring, the one he'd given her after their first fight. "You once said love was a distraction. Turns out, you were right." Edward's throat tightened. "Clara. Don't." She shouldered her bag, the front door creaking open. "Go be the hero of your own story." As she disappeared into the rain, Edward noticed the shattered remains of her sculpture on the floor, a twisted mass of wire and broken glass. It looked like a heart. The pregnancy test sat on the bathroom counter like a ticking bomb. Clara stared at it, her hands trembling. 2 pink lines. Triplets. She sank onto the edge of the tub, nausea rolling through her, not just from morning sickness but from the weight of what this meant. Edward was out there somewhere, closing deals, building empires, chasing shadows. He'd made it clear where his priorities lay. Telling him about the babies would only complicate things, for both of them. "I can do this," she whispered to herself, clutching her stomach. "I have to." But doubt crept in. How could she raise 3 children alone? Her freelance art gigs barely paid rent, let alone diapers and formula. Still, something inside her hardened, a quiet resolve. She wouldn't let fear dictate her life. Not again. That night, she wrote Edward a letter. Pages filled with raw honesty, *, "You'll never read this, but I need to say it. These babies are mine now. Ours, biologically, but yours no longer. You chose ambition over us long ago. And while I hate you for it, I won't let your absence define them, or me." By dawn, she burned the letter in the sink, watching the edges curl into ash. From that moment, Clara vowed to build a life without him, one where her children would always come first. The years that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, endless laundry, and peanut butter sandwiches. Clara juggled odd jobs, waitressing, teaching art classes, even cleaning offices, to make ends meet. Her loft became a kaleidoscope of chaos, Theo's Legos scattered across the floor, James and Amelia giggling as they finger-painted murals on butcher paper taped to the walls. Despite the exhaustion, Clara found joy in the little moments. Like when Theo proudly showed her his first-grade drawing of their family, "That's Mommy, and that's me, and those are my brother and sister." Or when James and Amelia held hands during thunderstorms, whispering secrets only twins understood. Her art suffered, though. Galleries stopped calling, editors ghosted her emails. But Clara refused to give up. Late at night, after the kids were asleep, she'd sneak into her studio, a converted closet, and paint by candlelight. Abstracts, mostly, swirls of color that captured the turbulence of her heart. One winter, money got so tight she pawned her grandmother's locket to buy Christmas presents. The kids didn't notice, they were too busy unwrapping hand-knitted scarves and second-hand toys. As they laughed, Clara realized something profound: happiness wasn't about wealth or perfection. It was about love. And there was plenty of that in their tiny Brooklyn apartment. When Theo turned 6, he asked, "Why don't we have a daddy?" Clara hesitated, then knelt beside him. "Some people aren't ready to be parents," she said gently. "But you've got me, and each other. That's more than enough." Theo nodded solemnly, then hugged her tight. In that moment, Clara felt invincible. The Plaza Hotel sparkled under a canopy of chandeliers as Edward Langston strode through its gilded halls. At 41, he was no longer just a self-made millionaire, he was an icon. His name graced billboards, tech conferences, and Forbes covers. Tonight, Manhattan's elite had gathered to witness his union with Veronica St. James, a woman whose pedigree rivaled European royalty. Champagne flutes clinked as guests mingled beneath crystal sconces. Senators, CEOs, even a Grammy-winning pop star toasted Edward's success. He smiled politely, shaking hands and accepting compliments, but his mind wandered. "Nervous?" Veronica whispered, slipping her arm through his. Her Vera Wang gown shimmered like moonlight, every stitch worth more than most people made in a decade. "Of course not," Edward replied smoothly. "Why would I be?" Veronica raised an eyebrow. "Because your ex-girlfriend is coming." Edward stiffened. Clara Matthews. For weeks, her RSVP card had haunted him, regrets, Clara Matthews and family. Who were these family members? Friends? Relatives? The thought gnawed at him, though he'd never admit it. "I'm over her," he said firmly, more to himself than Veronica. But deep down, doubt lingered. Was she happy? Had she found someone else? Someone better? Edward pushed the questions aside. Whatever Clara's life looked like now, it didn't matter. He'd built an empire without her. And tonight, he'd crown it with a marriage that solidified his place among the untouchable elite. As waiters circulated with hors d'oeuvres, Edward glanced at the grand staircase. Any minute now, Clara would walk down those steps, and he intended to show her exactly what she'd lost. In a modest hotel room across town, Clara adjusted her dress in front of a cracked mirror. It wasn't designer, it was thrifted, but it fit perfectly, hugging her curves before flowing into a soft A-line skirt. She twisted her curls into a loose bun, letting a few strands frame her face. Behind her, Theo straightened his tie while James and Amelia argued over who got to carry the bouquet. "Mom, are you sure about this?" Theo asked, frowning. At 11, he was old enough to sense tension. Clara turned, forcing a smile. "It's just closure, sweetie. Your dad deserves to know about you. And you deserve to meet him. But what if he doesn't care?" Amelia piped up, clutching her stuffed bunny. "He will," Clara said softly, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Even if he doesn't say it, knowing you exist might change something for him. For all of us." She knelt, pulling her children close. "Listen carefully. We're not here for revenge or drama. We're here because honesty matters. No matter what happens tonight, we'll leave together, as a family. Okay?" They nodded solemnly, their small faces filled with determination. By the time they arrived at the plaza, Clara's heart pounded like a war drum. As they ascended the marble staircase, whispers rippled through the crowd. Guests craned their necks, trying to glimpse the mysterious Clara Matthews, and the 3 children trailing behind her. Edward spotted them immediately. His champagne flute slipped from his fingers, shattering on the floor. For a moment, time froze. Clara stood there, radiant yet resolute, her hand resting protectively on Theo's shoulder. Behind her, James and Amelia peeked out shyly, their resemblance to Edward unmistakable. Edward's voice caught in his throat. "What? Who are they?" Clara stepped forward, her gaze steady. "These are your children, Edward." "Our children." Shock rippled across his face. Then anger. Then something softer, regret, perhaps. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Clara continued, her tone calm but firm. "I came because they deserve to know where they come from. Because you deserve the truth." Edward stared at her, then at the kids, his world tilting on its axis. The string quartet played a soft rendition of Pachelbel's canon as guests filed into the grand ballroom of the plaza. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over rows of white roses and towering candelabras. Every detail screamed perfection, from the monogrammed napkins to the custom-designed cake that stood 12 tiers high. Veronica St. James floated through the chaos backstage, her gown trailing behind her like a cloud. She adjusted her diamond-studded tiara and glanced at Edward, who stood nervously by the altar. "Relax," she murmured, squeezing his hand. "This is our moment." Edward forced a smile, but his mind raced. Clara's RSVP had been gnawing at him for weeks, though he tried to brush it off. Clara Matthews and family, who were they? Why did the thought of seeing her again make his chest tighten? He shook his head, focusing on Veronica's radiant smile. This was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. Guests whispered admiringly as they took their seats. Governors, celebrities, tech moguls, all dressed to impress. Waiters glided between tables, offering flutes of Dom Perignon and hors d'oeuvres plated like works of art. "Ready?" the officiant asked, nodding toward the double doors where Veronica would soon appear. Edward nodded stiffly. Ready or not, there was no turning back now. As the music swelled and the crowd rose to their feet, Veronica stepped into view, her train shimmering under the lights. Gasps rippled through the room. She looked every bit the princess she'd always dreamed of being. But just as Edward extended his hand to greet her, a murmur spread from the back of the room. Heads turned. Whispers grew louder. Something, or someone, was stealing the spotlight. Clara paused at the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, Theo straightened his tie while James and Amelia clung to her hands. They weren't used to this kind of attention, and neither was she. But they'd rehearsed this moment in the hotel room earlier, heads held high, shoulders back, one foot in front of the other. She stepped forward, the click of her heels echoing across the marble floor. The room seemed to hold its breath. Guests parted like the Red Sea, craning their necks to see the woman who dared interrupt Manhattan's wedding of the year. Clara felt their stares, the judgment, the curiosity, but she kept walking. Her eyes locked onto Edward's, whose face went pale as he realized who stood before him. Behind her, the triplets followed, their resemblance to him impossible to ignore. Theo's sharp jawline mirrored Edward's profile. James's tousled dark hair matched his father's boyhood photos. Even little Amelia's piercing blue eyes bore an uncanny likeness to the man standing frozen at the altar. Veronica's voice cut through the silence. "What is this?" she demanded, her polished demeanor cracking. Clara stopped a few feet away, her gaze steady. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the tremor beneath it. "But these are your children, Edward." "Our children." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Someone dropped a champagne flute. Edward stared at her, then at the kids, his world unraveling in real time. You never told me." "I didn't think you'd care," Clara replied, her tone calm but laced with steel. "You made it clear years ago what mattered most to you." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His eyes darted between Clara and the children, searching for answers, or maybe excuses. Veronica stepped forward, her voice icy. "Explain yourself, Edward." Clara raised a hand, silencing her. "This isn't about you," she said firmly. "It's about them." She gestured to the triplets, who stood bravely despite the sea of strangers staring at them. "They deserve to know their father. And he deserves to know them." For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then Edward sank into a chair, his composure shattered. The room felt like it had been sucked into a vacuum. Every sound, the clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk gowns, had vanished, leaving only the deafening weight of Clara's words. Edward sat slumped in his chair, his hands gripping the edges as though trying to anchor himself to reality. His mind raced, but all he could focus on were their faces. Theo's serious expression, James's wide-eyed curiosity, Amelia's shy smile hiding behind her stuffed bunny. They looked so much like him, at least, how he used to look before success hardened his features. You never said anything," Edward finally managed, his voice hoarse. Clara crossed her arms, her posture unwavering. "Would it have mattered? You made your choice years ago. Your empire, your ambition, it came first. Always." Veronica stepped forward, her diamond earrings glinting under the chandelier light. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Edward, what is she talking about? Are these yours?" Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. His throat felt dry, his chest tight. He wanted to deny it, to say this was some cruel joke, but the truth stared back at him in triplicate. "Answer me." Veronica snapped, her composure cracking. Before Edward could respond, a small voice broke the silence. "Mommy," James whispered, tugging on Clara's sleeve. "Is he our daddy?" The question hung in the air, innocent yet devastating. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed wildly as guests leaned closer, eager to witness the fallout. Clara knelt beside her son, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly. "This is your father." James tilted his head, studying Edward with unfiltered curiosity. "Why didn't we meet him before?" Clara hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't scar him further. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean he can't be part of our lives now, if he wants to." Edward flinched at her words. If he wants to, it wasn't anger in her tone, it was resignation. As if she'd already accepted that he might walk away again. Veronica let out a bitter laugh, drawing everyone's attention. "Unbelievable," she spat, glaring at Edward. "You've been planning this wedding for months, and all along, you've had this waiting in the wings?" "It's not like that," Edward protested weakly, though even he didn't believe his own words. "Oh, really?" Veronica shot back. "Then explain it to me, because I sure as hell don't understand." Edward stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. For a moment, he looked like a man drowning, his eyes darting between Clara, the children, and Veronica, searching for a lifeline that didn't exist. "I didn't know," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of the crowd. "Clara never told me." "And whose fault is that?" Clara countered, rising to her full height. "You left me, Edward. Not the other way around. You chose power over people. And tonight isn't about blame, it's about them." She gestured to the triplets, who watched the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. Edward sank back into his seat, overwhelmed. His carefully constructed world, the wealth, the status, the illusion of control, was crumbling around him. All because of three small faces that mirrored his own. As the room buzzed with whispers, one thing became painfully clear: there would be no wedding today. The room erupted into chaos as Veronica St. James unleashed her fury. Her perfectly coiffed hair seemed to bristle with rage as she advanced on Edward, her diamond tiara glinting like a crown of ice. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" she hissed, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "You're standing here, ready to marry me, while your ex-girlfriend waltzes in with 3 children who look exactly like you? How could you not know about this?" Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked like a man caught in the headlights of an oncoming train, paralyzed, overwhelmed, and utterly unprepared for the collision. Veronica turned to Clara, her gaze venomous. "And you? Did you think this was entertainment? Ruining my wedding day just to make a point?" Clara didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hand resting protectively on Theo's shoulder. "This isn't about you," she said calmly, though her knuckles whitened where they gripped her son's arm. "It's about them." She nodded toward the triplets, whose wide eyes darted between their parents and the shouting adults. "Oh, spare me the noble act," Veronica snapped. "If you really cared about those kids, you wouldn't have brought them here today. This is cruelty, plain and simple." "No," Clara shot back, her voice rising. "Cruelty would have been letting him live his life without knowing he has children. Cruelty would have been keeping them from the truth because it was easier than facing him." Veronica laughed bitterly, throwing up her hands. "Well, congratulations. You've succeeded in destroying everything. My reputation, my family name. This isn't your family." Clara interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "These are his children. His responsibility. And if you can't handle that, maybe you should reconsider marrying him." The crowd murmured in shock. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the spectacle unfold. Veronica spun back to Edward, her face flushed with humiliation. "Fix this," she demanded. "Now." But Edward remained frozen, his mind racing. Fix what? The shattered illusion of perfection? The years of secrets and lies? There was no quick fix for this mess. Finally, Edward found his voice, or at least the remnants of it. Pushing himself to his feet, he strode toward Clara, his movements stiff and mechanical. "How could you keep this from me?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with accusation. Clara met his gaze head-on, her expression unwavering. "How could I not? Look at yourself, Edward. When we were together, all you cared about was your company, your ambition, your empire. Do you honestly think I believed you'd drop everything to play house with me and a baby, or 3? That's not fair," Edward shot back, though guilt flickered in his eyes. "Isn't it?" Clara countered. "You told me love was a distraction. That success mattered more than anything else. So forgive me if I didn't think you'd suddenly transform into Father of the Year." Edward clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "You didn't even give me a chance. And why should I have?" Clara asked, her voice breaking slightly. "You walked away first, Edward. You chose this life over us. Over me. Don't pretend you didn't know what you were doing." For a moment, silence fell between them. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, punctuated only by the soft sniffles of Amelia, who clung to her brother James. Edward glanced down at the triplets, their faces mirroring his own confusion and pain. I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to say anything right now," Clara replied softly, her tone shifting from anger to something softer, regret, perhaps. "Just meet them. Talk to them. They're your kids, Edward. Whether you're ready or not, they're part of your life now." Edward sank back onto the chair, his shoulders slumping under the weight of realization. His carefully curated world, the wealth, the power, the prestige, it all felt hollow compared to the tiny human standing before him. As the guests began to disperse, muttering among themselves, Veronica let out a final, scathing remark. "Congratulations, Edward. You've officially ruined everything." With that, she stormed out, her gown trailing behind her like a defeated banner. Edward watched her go, then turned back to Clara and the children. For the first time in years, he felt truly lost. The grand ballroom of the plaza felt eerily silent now, save for the distant echo of Veronica's heels clicking against the marble floor. Her gown shimmered like a ghost as she strode toward the exit, her head held high despite the cracks in her composure. Every step radiated fury and humiliation, each one punctuated by the sharp snap of her clutch against her palm. At the doorway, she paused, turning back to Edward with a look that could freeze fire. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said, her voice cold but trembling with suppressed emotion. "I don't know who you are anymore." Edward opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? That he hadn't meant for any of this to happen? That he'd been blindsided by a truth he'd never imagined? None of it mattered, not to her, not now. "You wanted perfection," Veronica continued, her eyes blazing. "A flawless life, a flawless wife, a flawless future. Well, congratulations, Edward. You've created a masterpiece of lies. Enjoy your ruin." With that, she turned on her heel and disappeared through the doors, leaving behind a trail of shattered dreams and broken promises. The remaining guests exchanged awkward glances before quietly slipping away, unwilling to witness the fallout. Within minutes, the opulent room was nearly empty, its gilded splendor feeling hollow without the laughter and celebration it had been designed for. Edward stood motionless, staring at the spot where Veronica had stood. For years, he'd chased this moment, a union with someone like her, a symbol of his success. Now, it lay in ruins at his feet. Clara watched him from across the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't gloat or revel in his pain, instead, there was a quiet sadness in her expression, as if she understood the weight of what he was facing. "Are you okay?" Theo asked softly, tugging at her sleeve. Clara knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'm fine, sweetheart. But your dad, he has a lot to think about right now." Edward finally moved, dragging himself toward Clara and the children. He stopped a few feet away, his shoulders slumped, his face pale. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "That's okay," Clara replied gently. "You don't have to figure everything out today. Just, be here. Be present. They deserve that much." Edward looked down at the triplets, their faces filled with curiosity and uncertainty. Theo studied him with cautious interest, James clung to his sister Amelia, who shyly peeked out from behind her stuffed bunny. They were strangers, yet they carried pieces of him in their smiles, their eyes, their mannerisms. "I failed you," he said suddenly, his voice cracking. "All of you. I didn't even know you existed, and now," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "It wasn't just you," Clara interjected, her tone firm but kind. "We both made mistakes. But the past is done. What matters now is what happens next." Edward nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in his eyes. "I don't know how to do this," he confessed. "How to be a father. How to fix any of this." "You'll learn," Clara said simply. "One day at a time. And we'll help you." For the first time since Clara's arrival, Edward allowed himself to hope. Not for redemption or forgiveness, he knew those would take time, but for a chance to rebuild something meaningful. Something real. As he knelt down to meet the triplets' gaze, he felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crumble. Success, power, ambition, they all seemed insignificant compared to the three small faces looking up at him with cautious optimism. "Hi," he said softly, offering a tentative smile. I'm your dad." Theo tilted his head, studying him intently. Do you want to be? Edward hesitated, then nodded. More than anything. Clara stepped back, giving them space. As Edward reached out to shake Theo's hand, she felt a flicker of relief. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even close, but it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings were enough. The air in the now empty ballroom felt heavy with unspoken truths. Edward stood awkwardly beside Clara and the children, his hands shoved into his pockets as if unsure what to do with them. The weight of the day pressed down on him, Veronica's fury, Clara's quiet strength, and the undeniable reality of 3 sets of eyes staring up at him, waiting for something he didn't yet know how to give. I want to be a father, he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. To all of you. Clara raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed over her chest. Do you even know what that means? She asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. Being a parent isn't just showing up when it's convenient. It's late-night fevers, school plays, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. It's putting someone else's needs ahead of your own every single day. Are you ready for that? Edward hesitated, guilt flickering across his face. He thought back to his own childhood, the nights his father worked late, the weekends his mother spent juggling 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Hadn't he vowed never to repeat their mistakes? Yet here he was, standing at the edge of the same abyss. No, he admitted quietly. I'm not ready. But I want to try. Clara studied him, searching for sincerity beneath the polished exterior. She'd seen this side of him before, the vulnerability hidden behind ambition, but it had been years since she'd allowed herself to trust it. It won't be easy, she warned. You've built your life around control and success. These kids? They'll challenge everything you think you know about yourself. And they deserve more than half measures or empty promises. Edward nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness, not from you, not from them. But I'm willing to earn it. Whatever it takes. For a moment, Clara softened, her gaze lingering on his face. Beneath the tailored suit and commanding presence, she saw glimpses of the man she'd once loved, the one who used to dream bigger than himself. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope for him. All right, she said finally. But we're doing this my way. No shortcuts. No excuses. Edward exhaled, relief washing over him. Thank you, he murmured, though he knew words weren't enough. Actions would have to speak louder now. The next morning, Edward arrived at Langston Tech's headquarters, a sleek glass tower that loomed over Manhattan like a monument to his ambition. For years, it had been his sanctuary, the place where he'd poured every ounce of energy and focus. Today, however, it felt suffocating. He called an emergency meeting with his executive team, surprising even his assistant, who rarely saw him without a meticulously planned schedule. I'm stepping back, he announced, cutting straight to the point. Effective immediately, I'll be reducing my role in day-to-day operations. I'm appointing Sarah Chen as interim CEO until further notice. The room erupted into murmurs. His CFO leaned forward, incredulous. Edward, are you sure about this? You've dedicated your entire life to this company. I know, Edward replied, his voice firm. And that's exactly why I need to step away. There's something more important I need to focus on. His team exchanged uneasy glances, clearly skeptical of his sudden change of heart. But Edward didn't care. For the first time in years, he wasn't making decisions based on profit margins or stock prices. After the meeting, he returned to Clara's loft, where the triplets were sprawled on the floor, building a fort out of blankets and couch cushions. Theo spotted him first, pausing mid-construction. What are you doing here? He asked, suspicion coloring his tone. Edward knelt down, meeting him at eye level. I told you I wanted to be a dad. That starts today. Clara emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. You're early, she said, arching an eyebrow. I quit, Edward replied simply. Her jaw dropped. You what? I stepped back from the company, he explained. Not completely, I'll still oversee major decisions, but I'm delegating most of my responsibilities. I need time to figure this out. To figure us out. Clara stared at him, torn between disbelief and admiration. That's a big move. It's necessary, Edward said, glancing at the kids. They deserve better than the scraps of my attention. So do you. For a moment, Clara didn't respond. Then she smiled faintly, a hint of warmth breaking through her guarded expression. All right, then. Let's see if you mean it. As Edward joined the triplets in constructing their blanket fort, laughter filling the small apartment for the first time in years, he realized something profound: success wasn't measured by wealth or power. It was measured by connection. By love. And for the first time in a long time, Edward Langston felt truly rich. Edward's journey into fatherhood began awkwardly, like a man learning to walk again after years of standing still. The triplets, Theo, James, and Amelia, were hesitant at first, their trust guarded by years of absence. They weren't cruel about it, they simply didn't know how to let him in. One Saturday morning, Edward showed up at Clara's loft with a box of donuts and a nervous smile. Thought we could start small, he said, setting the box on the kitchen counter. Maybe, build something together? Clara raised an eyebrow but stayed quiet, watching from the doorway as Edward knelt beside the kids. What do you want to do today? He asked, his tone cautious but hopeful. Theo shrugged, flipping through a comic book. Dunno. James glanced at Amelia, who clutched her stuffed bunny tightly. We were gonna go to the park, she mumbled, barely meeting his eyes. The park sounds perfect, Edward replied quickly, masking his disappointment with enthusiasm. Can I come? Theo exchanged a look with his siblings before nodding reluctantly. I guess. At the park, Edward tried everything to engage them, pushing them on swings, teaching James how to throw a football, even attempting to join Theo and Amelia in a game of tag. It wasn't smooth sailing. Theo corrected his grip on the football, rolling his eyes when Edward fumbled it. Amelia giggled nervously during tag, unsure whether to include him. But slowly, cracks of connection began to form. By the end of the afternoon, James tugged on Edward's sleeve. You're not bad at this, he admitted shyly. Edward grinned, ruffling the boy's hair. Thanks, buddy. That means a lot. Over the weeks, Edward became a regular presence in their lives. He attended school plays, cheering loudly when Theo delivered his line without stumbling. He helped James practice multiplication tables, turning math drills into silly games. And he sat patiently while Amelia painted pictures, asking thoughtful questions about her artwork. It wasn't easy. There were moments of frustration, for all of them. Theo once snapped, "You don't get to just show up now," during a heated argument over homework. Edward swallowed his pride and apologized, promising to do better. But bit by bit, the walls came down. The triplets started seeking him out, asking if he'd play catch or read bedtime stories. And Edward, for the first time in years, felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. From the sidelines, Clara watched Edward's transformation with a mix of skepticism and quiet admiration. She'd seen men make promises before only to break them later. But there was something different about Edward this time, a sincerity that went beyond words. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, she found him sitting on the couch, scrolling through photos on his phone. He looked up when she entered, offering a sheepish smile. "Just looking at pictures from today," he said, holding up the screen. It was a snapshot of him and the triplets at the park, mid-laugh, their faces glowing with joy. "They're starting to trust you," Clara observed, sitting beside him. I hope so, Edward replied, his voice tinged with vulnerability. I know I have a long way to go. But every time they smile at me, it feels like I'm finally doing something right. Clara studied him, noting the dark circles under his eyes from late nights catching up on work and the faint smudge of paint on his sleeve from helping Amelia earlier. This wasn't the same Edward who had walked away years ago, the one who valued ambition above all else. This version of him was softer, more human. You're changing, she said softly. For real this time. Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on the photo. I've spent my whole life chasing success, thinking it would fill the emptiness inside me. But being here, with them, it's the first time I've felt whole. Clara hesitated, then placed a hand on his arm. They need you, Edward. Not the CEO or the millionaire. Just you. He met her eyes, gratitude shining in his own. Thank you for giving me another chance. For letting me try. She smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in her expression. Don't thank me yet. You've got years of parenting ahead of you. Trust me, it's not always sunshine and rainbows. Edward chuckled, leaning back against the couch. I'll take whatever comes. As long as I get to be part of their lives. As they sat in companionable silence, the sound of laughter drifted down the hallway, the triplets dreaming of tomorrow. Clara glanced at Edward, seeing not just the man he'd been but the man he was becoming. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. 5 years had passed since the day Edward Langston walked into Clara's loft with a box of donuts and a nervous smile. In that time, he'd transformed, not just in how he looked but in who he was. The sharp edges of his ambition had softened, replaced by the warmth of laughter lines around his eyes and the calluses on his hands from helping James build model rockets or painting murals with Amelia. The triplets were no longer hesitant strangers, they were his children in every sense of the word. Theo, now 16, had grown into a thoughtful young man who shared Edward's love of strategy games and debate. He often challenged his father to chess matches, their banter laced with mutual respect. James, 14, was the family's unofficial scientist, always tinkering with gadgets and peppering Edward with questions about engineering. And Amelia, 12, had inherited Clara's artistic flair, filling sketchbooks with whimsical drawings inspired by their weekend hikes. Edward's days no longer revolved around board meetings or stock prices. Instead, they were filled with school plays, soccer practices, and late-night conversations about dreams and fears. His office at Langston Tech, a once pristine sanctuary, now sat mostly unused, its shelves lined with framed photos of him and the kids instead of trophies and awards. One crisp autumn afternoon, Edward stood on the sidelines of a soccer field, cheering as James scored a goal. "That's my boy," he shouted, pumping his fist in the air. Clara, sitting nearby with Theo and Amelia, rolled her eyes playfully. "You're louder than the entire team combined," she teased. Edward grinned, unbothered. Someone has to represent. After the game, the family gathered at their favorite diner, a cozy spot where the walls were covered in vintage posters and the milkshakes were legendary. As they slid into their usual booth, Edward glanced around the table, taking in the sight of his children laughing and teasing each other. "You know," he said after a moment, his voice softening, "I used to think wealth was about money. About having the biggest house, the fanciest car, the most successful company. But sitting here with all of you, this is what real wealth feels like." Theo raised an eyebrow, ever the skeptic. "Are you getting sentimental on us, Dad?" "Maybe," Edward admitted with a chuckle. "But it's true. None of those things ever made me happy, not really. You guys did. This life we've built together, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Amelia smiled shyly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "We're glad you're here, Dad." Edward's throat tightened, but he managed a smile. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the city skyline, Edward found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Once, he'd been a man consumed by ambition, chasing success as if it were the only thing worth living for. Now, he understood that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or accolades, it was measured in moments. Moments like these, watching Theo solve puzzles faster than he could, marveling at James's curiosity about the world, or admiring Amelia's artwork hanging proudly on the fridge. He thought back to the night of the wedding, the chaos, the revelations, the pain. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything. But looking back, he realized it had been the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter, one filled with love, forgiveness, and second chances. That evening, as the family returned home, Edward paused in the doorway of the living room. Inside, the triplets sprawled on the floor, building a sprawling Lego city while Clara sketched quietly in the corner. The scene was ordinary, yet it filled him with an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Hey," he called softly, drawing their attention. "Thank you. All of you." "For what?" James asked, tilting his head curiously. "For being my family," Edward replied simply. "For showing me what really matters." Clara smiled, setting aside her sketchpad. "You earned your place, Edward. No one gave it to you, you worked for it. Every step of the way." Edward nodded, his gaze lingering on each of them. "And I'll keep working for it. Because this is what makes life worth living." As the kids resumed their Lego project, calling out ideas and giggling over silly jokes, Edward joined them on the floor. Together, they added towers, bridges, and tiny figures to the growing city, a metaphor for the life they'd built together. The camera pans out slowly, capturing the warmth of the room, the soft glow of lamplight, the sound of laughter, the unmistakable bond between parent and child. A narrator's voice fades in, gentle and reflective. In the end, true wealth isn't found in bank accounts or boardrooms. It's found in the connections we nurture, the love we share, and the lives we touch. For Edward Langston, the journey wasn't easy, but it led him to something far greater than success. It led him home. The screen fades to black, leaving only the faint echo of laughter and the words, "True wealth is love." At its heart, this story is about the choices we make and the lives they shape. Edward Langston began his journey chasing success, believing wealth and power would bring him happiness. But it wasn't until he faced the consequences of his choices, losing Clara, missing out on his children's early years, that he discovered what truly matters: love, family, and human connection. This story reminds us that success isn't defined by how much we achieve but by how deeply we connect with others. It challenges us to ask ourselves, are we building a life that fulfills us, or are we simply climbing ladders that lead nowhere? True wealth isn't found in bank accounts or accolades, it's found in the moments we share with the people who matter most. If this story resonated with you, don't miss the chance to dive deeper into more tales like this one. Subscribe to our channel and join a community of viewers who believe in the power of storytelling to inspire, challenge, and transform. Every new story we share is crafted to take you on an emotional journey, just like this one. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update, and be part of a growing audience that values meaningful content. Because the next story might just be the one that changes your perspective, or even your life.